That's wrong.
Hey, man. You can cut that part out, right?
What's architecture really about? Archispeak is the show that dares to peek under the architectural kimono, exposing what architecture really is, what it is that architects really do, and show you why we are passionate about our chosen profession. I'm Neil Pan. Join Evan Troxel, Cormac Phelan, and me as we have a casual conversation about all things architecture, which includes all the stuff people don't talk about. Think you already know what architecture is really about? Tune in to find out. It's time for some Archispeak.
So, Cormac, why don't you start us off for episode 12 about your story about the recent site visit you had?
All right, well, kind of the topic that I want to talk about today on this episode comes from, I had a free weekend, no family, nothing. I hopped in the car, I drove west for about 3 hours and ended up in Fallingwater. Took a great tour of both the Kentucky Knob or Kentuck Knob site that they've got, which, you know, they had some good docents there, but wasn't as kind of in tune with what was going on with, they didn't seem to be as educated as the docents at Fallingwater. And I could tell that one of the docents there was either an architect by trade or probably an architectural historian. She was this German lady that, we kind of kept having these side conversations as we were walking through. Everybody was, doing the ooh and the ah, and I really wasn't saying much because I don't really like to talk during architectural tours. One, because either I know the subject matter and either kind of disagree with what they might be saying, or don't know the subject matter and I just want to absorb what I'm hearing. But as we were talking, we started talking about how Americans, now this is coming from a German, how Americans view the longevity of architecture. And I started thinking about permanence in architecture. And not necessarily the whole Vitruvian, firmness type permanence in architecture, but more of what we build, how we design, how we specify the materials. And I'm talking more about today's architecture. Are we kind of designing obsolescence into our buildings as we're designing them? And what I mean by that is, if you look at, and I review submittals all the time, and one of the main things that I have to review is the material warranties. Warranties for 5 years, warranties for 10 years, possibly up to maybe 20 years. So we're essentially designing buildings with a material lifespan of maybe 20 years. Craftsmanship, probably a little bit longer than that. And so it just got me thinking about, the permanence of architecture. Just wanted to really open up a conversation and see what you guys, think about. Is it something that we should really worry about? Does architecture really need to be something that is long lasting? Or is it something that we should accept as temporary? So I'm just going to throw that out there.
Well, when I'm dealing in the public arena and, there's different levels of the public arena. But I mean, if you go, Cormac, if you go to Washington D.C. and you visit the national art museums and you visit the monuments, I mean, those are built to last, right? Those are, and not only are they built to last, they're built for thousands of people to touch them every day. And then I'm dealing on another level, which is schools, which get thousands of kids in them every day. And they're dealing with an entirely different budget, right? They're dealing with, how good can you make it for as little money as possible? Because they never have enough money to build the school that they should be building.
True.
But the school should last 100 years. And then I'm thinking about the car that I'm restoring that's 40 years old. It's actually almost 45 years old. And it needs to be entirely redone. And most of, I live in a house that was built in 1947. And because of the owners who were here before me, it's in really good shape. And I think what it really comes down to is permanence has a lot to do with how you take care of and how you maintain the building. Because
totally
the buildings that we build today out of sticks and stucco and, for the most part, at least here in Southern California, they are not meant to last that long, but you can make them last that long. But it's like a car. You've got to maintain it.
Well, I think...
And rebuild. You look at all these Neutra buildings and these Frank Lloyd Wright buildings and these Lautner buildings and Schindler buildings, and they do have to be gone through and sorted out and redone because they were cheap architecture at the time. But if you care about them, then people do rebuild them the right way.
Well, but isn't that also true of some of these more monuments that you mentioned in D.C.? I mean, sure, they're built with materials that are going to last longer than a wood frame and stucco. But yet at the same time, it seems every time I'm in D.C., some structure is always under some sort of reconstruction or repair to those monuments. Yeah. So even though they might be built to last a little longer, they're not built forever.
Well, I'm glad that you guys both brought up DC, and let me use this as an example. IMPA's National Gallery of Art, there's the East Wing and the West Wing. One is, more of a traditional design, and then you've got Pei's extraordinarily uber modern. Was designed in the 70s.
Uber modern in the 70s. Yeah. And
recently, and I think it was just after you guys left, Neil, from last year's AIA convention, that the scaffolding started going up, and every single bit of its exterior cladding, all of the stone, was removed, and every bit of the steel, basically brackets and hooks and everything else that were used to put this building, put the cladding on, had failed, and has been failing actually for the past, I don't know, maybe a half decade. And they recognized that there was huge problems with it, and they spent probably, Evan, you and I would look at the budget that they spent just on repairing this one building and think to ourselves, well, that could have been 2 or 3 different schools.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Brand new schools. And, so you wonder, we look at the building and we think about how, fantastic it is, cutting edge design. At that point in time, I mean, nobody was doing, he was trying to take a traditional building method and make it do something in a modern interpretation that's never been done before. And, so he experimented with the way that the veneer was held onto the building, and ultimately it failed.
Well, it has this super monolithic look and feel to it, right? But what you're saying is it's a curtain wall.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. if once it was pulled down, it looked like any brick veneer that I would do on, one of our schools that the school board requires us to put a brick veneer on.
But when I visited that building when I was in college, and that was one of the first buildings that I was ever in that was real architecture. It sat me down and made me look up at that skylight, say, whoa. And it changed how I felt when I walked into that room. And I think, when you're talking about the permanence of architecture, not all architecture deserves to be permanent.
And that's, I'm glad you're going that direction, because that was kind of where my that's where the conversation wanted to go. Is it permanence if it's something that lasts forever, or if it's permanence in its way that it makes you feel? Which goes back to the whole, definition, the Vitruvian definition of firmness. I mean, it's that lovable architecture. And so I didn't mean to cut you off, but I'm kind of glad you're going in that direction.
Well, yeah, because we deal with historic buildings all the time. And, there's different levels of historic that need to be preserved, right? I mean, we know that there's restoration and there's preservation and there's all of these, there's like 5 different levels of saving old buildings to certain extents. And not all of it deserves to be saved just because of how it looks. And I think a lot of people get caught up in how it looks, right? I mean, that's a lot of what people's definition of architecture is. But to me, when I walked into Pay's building, it was how it feels. And that's what made it architecture to me.
Yes.
And so I think this is something that we struggle with all the time. I've worked with historic preservation architects who are experts in their field, and basically, they come up with a scale and where does this building fall within the scale, and is it on the National Register, or is it not, and do we need to just worry about the facade, and you could gut everything behind it, or do you need to worry about the whole building? And then you start thinking about cost. I mean, like you said, you could build a whole building or 2 for the cost of repairing the one building. And there's a lot of things to weigh there, but there is some sentimental thing that we just hang on to for dear life. And if you think about it, you could replace that building with something way better for a lot less money, and everybody would forget about the old building. I mean, how does that fall into the equation?
Well, when did you're talking about historic evaluation of buildings and such? When did this all begin? I'm a little curious about this because, and this kind of falls into that permanence idea, because when I was on our local historic preservation commission, our rule was basically any structure older than 50 years had to come through our commission, and and that was fine. That was a good rule of thumb to have and something. But, now maybe 60 years ago, or longer ago, say in the 1920s or 30s or 40s, nobody cared. If oftentimes a building burned down, and so a new building was created maybe in the 20s or 30s or 1900, and that's the building we now all love. But there was something there before that. But even, say in 1950 or something, and, some 1910 structure or 1880 structure, hell, they just tore it down. And nobody cared. It's like, that building's all run down. Let's just tear it down. We'll put up something with, brick or stone or concrete or something, and, kind of a different style of architecture. And yay, it's all great. And nobody really cared about historic preservation at the time. And so the permanence of buildings, when did we really start caring about our average buildings in our towns and neighborhoods? Maybe not since we're talking about Washington, certainly, the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Monument and some of these other, older structures that, we care about and that, obviously we want to preserve the history of. But what about our houses or our little commercial buildings in town. I mean, oftentimes a building is torn down, or shopping center, something's torn down. It's deemed architecturally insignificant. But who's to say it's insignificant today when maybe 50 years from now, maybe it will be?
Yeah, there was a John Lautner building nearby me in Pomona it was a restaurant or something, and it was torn down. And to me, if you go back and look at the imagery of this building, it was an amazing building. And it was like, I'm thinking, why the hell did they tear that thing down? It was this great thing, and I'm sure that they saw it. It was probably in disrepair, and it was an eyesore, and they wanted to put, the city probably rezoned it as commercial for, they wanted to make tax money off of this corner lot or whatever, and so they're like, yeah, let's get this thing out of here and let's put up some strip mall in its place and put in a parking lot. It goes both ways, right? There's stuff that you see that is preserved, and it's like, why the hell did they preserve that? And then there's other stuff that's torn down, and you're like, why did they tear that down? But then it goes the opposite way for those groups of people as well.
Exactly. And talking about the kind of like the memory lane of architecture, this past weekend we went to Gettysburg because it's the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. So we went to Gettysburg, but to me it was kind of a bittersweet going because probably about 3 months ago they tore down the Richard Neutra Cyclorama building.
Oh, yeah.
And, I mean, Neutra, if anybody knows me, Neutra is one of my favorite architects. And, we've got very few examples of his work on this side of the country. And, you go there, I went there probably about 2 months before they finally demolished the building. And you go there and you're looking at it, and there's really no reason. I mean, structurally, it's in great condition. Probably, it clearly needs, new coats of paint and a lot of cleaning. And probably, recalk it and maybe re-roof it because they walked away from that building. That building no longer served their need. They built a brand new visitor center and brand new cyclorama. So that building no longer fit the bill for them. They walked away from it and left it there to basically decay on its own. And surprisingly enough, it actually stood up pretty well for something that they literally just ignored. Went there on Saturday, you would never know it was ever there. It has been demoed. They've regraded it. Grass has grown in, but you're never going to be able to. I remember when I went there and it was still open for the first time, decade or so ago, and you would get the perspective of the battlefield from any other place but the observation deck on the roof of that building. And so you can go in there and you can sit in the field and say, okay, this is how, they saw it back in
first person perspective.
Exactly. But, in this particular case, we're not trying to go for the first person perspective. We're trying to kind of get the breadth of, this entire battlefield from, General Meade's headquarters all the way over to the Pickett's Charge, and see everything together. And you're just not able to do that anymore. But their rationale was that they just wanted to return it back to the way it was, even though there's a McDonald's and a Kentucky Fried Chicken and all this other stuff within view of the battlefield. So you just it's just you look at it and you're like, well, why? Just like you were saying, Evan, it's like, why is one building more important than another? But then you ask, okay, well, if it doesn't serve its purpose, because, my wife and I say this often, if a building has been abandoned for 5 years and no one's, clearly using it, why don't they come in and they demo it, and either return that land back to, the natural order of land, or, just repurpose it for something else. So it's just this interesting, it goes back to what Neil was saying, is when did we start caring about preserving buildings? And is it because of this nostalgic feel that we want to continue to keep feeling? Is, I remember back in the day when I went to this building, it made me feel like this, so I want to keep the building and keep feeling like that.
That's our hoarder mentality that we have, right? We have the sentimental value tied up in so many things.
Well, an example of a building I visited and it reminds me of your cyclorama story is Villa Savoie how do you say that? Savoie? Okay. By Corbusier. And when I saw that building in the early 90s, it wasn't in very good shape. And since then it's been restored and the opposite of what happened to Neutra's building. Somebody thought there was value to that and spent the money and repaired it and fixed it up and decided not to tear it down. So hopefully we're better off as in our architectural community for that. But but that's an example of a building that was in disrepair and was fixed up.
I've been a part of a couple of online petitions trying to get the word out about them. For architecture that's on the endangered list, right? I mean, there's been examples where developers have come in under a guise where they're going to fix up a place, and then they immediately, as soon as the purchase has gone through, they tear it down and subdivide the land and build 4 townhomes on it. And that was about to happen to the David Wright House in Phoenix or Scottsdale. That was about to happen to the Cronish House in Beverly Hills. And
exactly.
There's these examples with Frank Lloyd Wright houses and Richard and Dion Neutra houses where, because of the internet, they have been able to been saved. But then, there's always kind of this controversy surrounding these places that are kind of on the verge of, or maybe they're not even in that bad a shape, but it's just an opportunity for somebody to come in and work the system because it's a prime piece of real estate.
I was going to just point out, in my local community, that's happened quite a bit, where we've seen older homes from the 30s or something that are just fine, and they may be even newer, maybe from the 50s, but they were built on larger lots that could be subdivided. And in some cases, they're torn down because they're deemed architecturally insignificant, or there's no history, no local famous person, lived there or was visited there, or it wasn't their place of business, or just there's nothing, or there's multiple versions of that same type of house, same detailing, spread throughout the city. So it's not like the last one or the only one. And that's a difficult, it's a difficult thing. Our city is very good about going through and analyzing all of those different aspects of an older home, or an older building in town to determine, is this worthy or is it okay to tear it down? And that's really nice. And oftentimes it is an opportunity for a developer to come in. I can think of 3 different examples where that's happened in town, where, there's opportunity to build 4 townhomes or more, on a site. And there's one good example where even the developer wanted to move a house, and there was a huge effort put in by the city, by the developer, by the local historical society to save this house. And it was actually picked up, moved like 2 blocks down the street and put onto another vacant lot. And so there's a success story there. Now that house still exists. It may not be in its original location, but it's it's still there, and something for everybody in town to cherish. Yeah. So sometimes that that can work, and that the permanence of that building is going to last much longer now.
Well, let's take this even further, because you're bringing up a great point. By this one building, the city wanting to save it and relocate it, but does the relocation of that house then change the fabric of the place? Not just where it was, but now where it is, and the development that came in, and basically pushed this this house to 2 blocks down the road. How is all of this dynamic changed the spirit of the place?
Well, yeah, it definitely, in this case, it changed it a lot. In this one example, it was, where it was at before was it was still on a busy intersection in town. But now it's on another busy intersection, but it's right across the street from a McDonald's that's lit up all the time. And, you got this intersection actually has a stoplight. The other one didn't. So now, the person who now lives there has got these, red, yellow, green lights going off 24/7 in their living room. So it's not quite the same for that person. But, we've had other examples in town where an older building has been picked up and moved to another location. And actually, the one I'm thinking of is still it's not in that it's not even in the second location it was moved to. It's now in a third location being repurposed for another reason. And when it was in its second location, it actually fell into some pretty bad disrepair and was probably about 3 or 4 years ago used as a movie set, actually. And a film was filmed in that building, and then it was moved again. So not only did its original site change and develop to something else, but its second site has now been changed to something else, and it still lives on in a third location.
Well,
now.
Let me give you a couple different examples of my experience where.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a school that I was working on. It's a K-8. It's in Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills has 4 or 5 K-8s. They have a lot. They have one high school. So all these schools feed into the high school. Their enrollment is dropping over the next 10 years, projections. And they've got these schools that were built in the 1920s. All these K-8s were built in the 1920s. And buildings that were built in the 1920s do not fit the educational system of 2013. They are definitely not going to fit the education system of 2020 or 2030.
No.
That the spaces are not conducive to our modern educational environment. It would be cheaper to tear the building down and build a new one than it is to fix the existing building. Okay, so in that case, where you're talking about a specific use, what it's going to be. They were actually considering just keeping the front facade of the building to keep all the people who live within 4 blocks of that school happy, but everything behind it would be completely new. Okay, wow. Now another flip side of that coin is the High Line in New York. I had the occasion to go visit that a few months ago, and I walked it with 2 of my friends, Mark Schumann, Mark LePage, and it was like they took this old crappy thing and they made it this. They activated the meatpacking district of New York City with an elevated train. It's insane, and it is unbelievably awesome what they've done with that part of the city. I mean, DSNR did an amazing job with a very small kit of parts. They've got the same stuff everywhere, but it creates this experience that weaves through blocks and blocks of the city, and it is amazing. And it was like, if they would have tore this thing down and we never saw the High Line, like that, it's just an amazing thing to think about when you're there. You're like, this might not have ever existed. and it's this old thing. Those are two different sides of the story where it's like, one, it doesn't fit, right? But then you've got New York City, and they made it fit. Because they were able to think out of the box. And I think that when you're repurposing old architecture, even if it's not a building, if it's an elevated train, it just is. It's pretty phenomenal what people can do if they don't think within the original constraints. And I think even with that school in Beverly Hills, there's ways to make old buildings do new things. And it's pretty exciting constraints to work within as an architect.
You've just explained the last 5 years of my life.
Yeah, yeah, right. With it in Annapolis, right?
Yeah,
right. Well, let's take this back a little further. I mean, we're talking about buildings maybe 100 to 120 years old, but what about buildings a couple thousand years old, or maybe not a couple thousand years old, but even 200, 300, 400 years old? I know when I lived in Italy, there were, literally every building was repurposed at some point for something else.
It is important to bring up the differences in different parts of the world, because when I was in school, what I was told is there are pieces of land in Europe that are set aside for great architecture, where in the U.S., it's not like that at all for the most part. It's just like whatever happens, happens. Whoever gets there first. And I think that, they are thinking about that in a more permanent fashion when it comes to that respect.
Well, do you think they think that way because they have permanent architecture that's been around for thousands of years that around them? I mean, here, certainly Evan, you and I on the West Coast, what architectures existed, what's the oldest building outside of, the missions,
150 years old.
Less than 150 years old, less than.
So,
I mean, that's nothing.
Well, and the perspective that we're all, talking about here is purely an American thing. Because to bring it back to this conversation that I was having with, this German lady is, I was talking to her about some of my experiences when I lived in Germany, and, how I would be standing on, these old castles that were 1,000 years old, and the point she was making about the American mentality and the European or old world mentality, we can say, is that they were raised not knowing that things should be disposable, that you should reuse and recycle them, that they were here, why not reuse them? Whereas,
well, that's a very sustainable way to think about things.
Right. But I mean,
Imagine that.
But think about the American mentality is that, big open roads. Let's, try to, reach from
conquer the new frontier, right?
Conquer the new frontier and dominate it and shape it the way that we want, to do it, So, we're bringing that old world feel when we first settled, and, we're doing kind of like the traditional building methods. And as we evolve and change, it's just like, okay, out with the old, in with the new. And that's how we always tend to approach almost everything. I mean, I listened to some architects who predominantly design retail, mostly shopping malls. And they said what they're building today is already outdated in the, model of retail 20 years from now. They're already thinking ahead, but they're already thinking and designing for basically, 20 to 30 year spurts.
Well, this is a whole...
We're going to rip this down and redo it.
So it is temporary.
Yeah, so they already know it's temporary.
This makes me think of a whole different argument that we could have another day, but it's, we build new that is in the style of the old all the time, right? I mean, that we built a new, quote unquote, outdoor shopping mall here, and I mean, it's it's like, okay, this street is Little Italy, and this street is modern, and this street is some other style. And in that point, it just becomes dogma, right? I mean, it's just that look for the sake of being that look and creating a certain kind of a feel. And so then you start to think, well, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? But that kind of falls under this whole saving old buildings, right? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
But Evan, out here on the West Coast, I mean, the shopping mall you just described, I guess what I'm getting at is you build with the materials and for the conditions in your area, wherever that might be. I'm just thinking when I was just in outside, well, ideally, yes. I mean, when I was just in Ottawa in Canada recently, I mean, every building was brick. That was the material they had. They don't have earthquakes. That stuff doesn't fall down like it would out here. And then when I lived in Italy, they weren't. I mean, they were just building buildings, and people were doing takeoffs of different styles from centuries ago. And so they were doing something like what we're doing today, except they were creating, old world styles in the 1700s. And it's not that much different from what we're doing today. But out here, we don't really have, I mean, what styles really do we have out here? Well, we have every style, exactly, because we can create that.
Yeah, and again,
and we do.
I think that's another conversation because style is different. Yeah,
that's true. Outside of permanence.
Yeah, and and then I want to throw Detroit into the old mix.
I was thinking about Detroit. Well. I mean, think about all of that, all of those abandoned buildings, and what is going to happen.
Well, here, wow,
that's a big thing.
That's a big thing, and it being near and dear to my heart because that's my place of birth, and I'll be there in 2 weeks, and for a 2-week spurt, and then we're gonna be back, and I travel and document the fall, the rise, the fall, and everything else of Detroit. And I'm actually sitting, while we're talking about this, I'm sitting surrounded by my father's old slides of him taking photographs of the Detroit area, basically from the mid 1950s all the way from when we left Michigan in the mid 70s. And I'm looking at all of these photographs, and I'm looking at what Detroit was and what I see Detroit is today. And there's no real connection that I have to my father's Detroit because I just don't see it. I don't see it there. I see the shell of what was there, but I don't see that place anymore.
Right. The vitality's gone. I mean, that's a big part of it, right?
But there's, and I say this often that Detroit is still one of my favorite cities because not only what it was, but I also think about what it still can be, in that there's, roots there. There's, the history and and we can start going through the philosophy of things and everything else, but there's a potential to build off of what was there, and move forward with, something, that basically kind of reflects what we've been talking about is, taking down some of the old, repurposing some of the old, and then just rebuilding new.
Yeah.
And they're doing that a lot, I mean, you see a lot of people and they'll photograph, these old burnt out houses and things like that. And yes, it is hugely prevalent there, but that's not exactly the image of the city that is really there.
Well, yeah. Look at what New York's doing at the World Trade Center site. I mean, they didn't rebuild the Twin Towers.
But I mean, you go to downtown Detroit, and downtown Detroit is not the burnt out buildings.
No.
Downtown Detroit is a thriving, town that people are investing lots of money into to rebuild or to invest in. I mean, there's a countless different, Fortune 500 corporations who basically, took all of the different incentives and things and moved their companies to downtown Detroit.
Well, yeah.
And, they see the potential,
Exactly.
so they want to build off of that. There's a guy who owns Quicken Loans, who he moved the entire Quicken Loans operation to downtown Detroit. And he's systematically buying up all of these different buildings, block after block after block, and has released basically his vision of what he feels, Detroit in the new millennium is going to be. Kind of reminds me of the new Detroit vision from RoboCop, but but I mean, he's got this vision of being able to kind of weave old and new together, and keep the spirit of what Detroit was but have it the new thriving of our time type Detroit.
Right.
Well, cities grow and change over time.
That's the beautiful thing about urban areas, man. It's like it's a set of Legos, right? I mean, it's amazing.
But I think this one has a potential to do something that no other major city,
because they were hurt so bad. Yeah.
Because they were hurt so bad in that, with white flight and everything else from the 60s on to today, basically it went from the 5th largest city in the entire world to a ghost town.
Yeah.
And now it's trying to, return to a city that has relevance and promise, and so it's really interesting.
Well,
I
was just going to say the permanence or lack thereof of architecture has a lot to do with the changes and the growth or the lack thereof in our cities as well. I mean, to kind of bring it around and tie it up, buildings. Buildings or structures. I mean, in San Francisco, after the '89 earthquake, the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco was damaged. It was taken out, and now suddenly the whole waterfront in downtown San Francisco is opened up again, and that completely changed.
And now
San
everyone
Francisco
is free to train for their marathon.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, well, this is something we could talk about forever, but we should probably wrap it up. Something else I guess we should maybe finish off with is we wanted to put it out there for everybody that Archispeak is a podcast that is completely self-reliant, and what we wanted to do was give people the opportunity to support the podcast. And so what we're going to be doing is on the next podcast, which is 2 weeks away, we're going to be reading off everybody's name who donates at least $5 on the donate page at archispeakpodcast.com. And so if you donate $5 through our PayPal there, we will read your name at the beginning of the next episode and as a friend of the show. And we would really appreciate it if you guys would show your support for the show and help us continue to make the show. That would be awesome.
So please donate.
That's right.
And get your name read.
Become famous. All right, Neil, you want to button it up here?
Sure. But if you have any questions or comments, please visit our website at archispeakpodcast.com or send us comments on our individual Twitter accounts, which are listed on the website. And you can also follow Archispeak on Twitter and visit our Facebook and leave some comments there. If you like the show as well, please give us a review on iTunes. That helps spread the word.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Bye-bye.
I joined the choir to sing. They're all competing for some other thing. I joined the choir to sing. I joined the choir to sing. They're all competing for some other thing. I joined the choir to sing. speech. You could say I eat, breathe, the race, my feet, my face, chase the one day.